Hi, my name is Pat Roach, and I'm a real happy person to be in Al-Anon. Sometimes more than others. And not always grateful for how I got here, but I'm not supposed to tell you about him. A lot of you here know him. And he's still out there doing what he does. Thank you so much for thinking of me, Don. Where are you, Don? There you are, over there somewhere. Anyway, it's nice to be invited here. And also for giving me the hostess with the mostest. You know, these mics are so far away, Don, that I feel... Can you hear me in the back? No. See, I thought so. I'm not supposed to touch things like this. But I... See, I usually travel with my own speech coach. Yes, you do. Now, can you hear me? No. Now, can you hear me? Yes. Does this remind you of an ad on TV? Okay, you're going to have to raise your hand if you can't, so we know, because I don't want to keep saying, can you hear me now? Well, I've just had an absolutely grand time here. And Dorothy has shown me, what beautiful. We drove up in the canyon today, and I just had to thank God for making all those beautiful sights for me to see. And the weather's beautiful, and oh my, it's been wonderful. And best of all, I've gotten to spend time with Al-Anons, which is my favorite thing to do. My husband and I travel quite a bit together, and I like that too. But when I come by myself, I get to spend lots of time with Al-Anons. And that's a real treat to me. And I want to congratulate, by the way, the new officers for Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, it reminds me whenever we have elections in our area, many, many years ago, I went to an AA meeting with my husband, and they had asked a brand new guy to read the traditions, which is kind of a dirty trick anyway. You know, those are hard. And he read, "Our leaders are but twisted servants." I'll never forget it. So congratulations to all the twisted servants. And I know there are some members of Alcoholics Anonymous here. And I will, as I always do, quote my best friend in the program, Blanche, who died a few years ago. She always liked to thank you for sharing so generously the AA program with Al-Anon. And she would add, you were, after all, so generous in sharing your disease. Those words should not die with her. They should keep going. This has really been fun. There are a lot of worker bees here, I can tell, people running around. Everybody's got a ribbon of some kind. And I ask what they're doing, and sometimes they'd say, I don't know, I'm just doing whatever they tell me. So that's a good sign, I think. That's a good sign. My husband, I guess, was invited to come. He's putting on a spiritual retreat this weekend. For those of you who know him, he doesn't strike you as being a spiritual retreat type person. And he's putting it on with his best pal, Scott Redmond. Anybody knows him? That combination, I don't know how they're going to do this thing, but he's in Eugene, Oregon, but he sends you his best, me. Because we've gotten to be here before, and we love the people here, and we love the program. And I loved being able to sit in on the delegates' activities today in Al-Anon and hear the delegates report, and one more time get reminded that it doesn't matter where we go, this program is still working, and it's still just going to keep right on working as long as there's people like the worker bees here willing to do the work. And it's just heartwarming. Well, my Al-Anon birthday is an example of God's sense of humor one more time. It's St. Patrick's Day of 1970. See, it's his sense of humor because without knowing it, I'd married a member of the CIA. That's a Catholic Irish alcoholic, for those of you that don't know. Coming from a father who was a Shriner and a member of the Masonic Lodge, there was a little bit of skirmishing around that. Much to my surprise, he was a heck of a lot of fun. I'm sure that's no surprise to hear for any of you to hear. Why else would I keep going out with this guy? He was met him in college, which just tells you a girl isn't safe anywhere. And it was a great time. for a girl to go to college. I was raised in a little town, then it was a little town, southeast of San Francisco called Los Gatos. I was born there. And went all the way to San Jose State, 12 miles away, in 1946 when the war ended. And all the guys came out on the GI Bill. And oh my God, they were, and I'd been raised to be patriotic. And if you're going to sit out there and try to figure out how old I am, because that's what I do, I'm 70-ish, and there's a lot more issues behind me than there are ahead of me. I don't care how old I am. I'm telling you, I'm just glad I'm still here. You know, it's I'm not sure I would have been without Al-Anon. But it was a blast going to college then. There were about 8 GIs on the GI Bill, because they hadn't had that before. And all of us little high school kids right out of high school, oh my gosh, it was heaven. And it was one party after another. And now I didn't have any money. My parents didn't have any money. So I had to work, and I didn't have scholarships because I'd done well in school, but I never applied for that stuff. I just kind of walked on through life and had a good time. School had been easy. I assumed it would be easy in college. Well, these GIs, as much fun as they were kind of serious about their studies. So my grades began slipping a little. Then I felt this obligation to attend parties. Had to join a sorority, of course, because that's where all the fun is. And it was at one of those parties that I heard this crashing noise on the back porch. And I went over and looked to see what was going on. There's this cute little guy, looked just like Mickey Rooney. He still does, really. And they both have grown in the same way as the years have gone on. And he was mad about something, which I was to learn was his way of life. But I didn't know that then. And he had these glasses, and he was smashing them against the refrigerator, breaking them, and cussing. And he was using 4-letter words. Well, now, I'd been raised in a rather rarefied environment. First of all, I wasn't raised around much anger, so I didn't know what to make of that. And I kind of knew what those 4-letter words were. I mean, I could say them, but the trouble is I didn't know which meant which thing, you know. So I didn't want to embarrass myself by using them. So that kind of fascinated me. That was really... And so I asked my date, who, as it turned out, was his roommate, I said, who is he and what's he doing? And he said, well, that's Cliff Roach, and he always does that when he drinks. And that's the man I married, folks. So who was the sick one, huh? The thing is, I always loved having a good time. My mom was one of the funniest people I've ever known. Guess what? She was alcoholic. She, to the day she died, she didn't admit that. But you know, if it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, she didn't admit that she was alcoholic. She would occasionally mention that she probably had had a little too much to drink the night before, when we would, say, yeah, like the week before. But she was a periodic alcoholic, and I think because of that, I didn't know there was such a thing. I really didn't know that till I got here and began learning. Probably explains why my household was really rather comfortable. I mean, she'd go 2-3 months or more, I'm sure, without drinking at all and having no problem with that. And then when I would come home from school, and I think I was probably early high school when I began putting all this together, I'd find her drinking orange juice through a straw. Well, that's because there was vodka in that orange juice. And for whatever reason, she drank it through a straw. And some nice alcoholic lady one time said to me, you know why she did that? I said, I had no idea. She said, you get a bigger kick out of it. Is that true? I don't think that's true. But that's what she did. So my clue was to come home and I'd see her drinking orange juice through a straw. And I would know that she was going to be drinking for a while, and I'd know not to bring my friends home. Now, my mom was an easygoing little drunk. She was only 4'10". She was always good-natured. She got a little sloppy towards the end of the evening. My father was the one that was difficult because he was always so depressed and so busy trying to stop her from doing what she was doing. Those chickens were to come home to roost, as you might imagine, when I found my own alcoholic. And the only thing, and she was easy to keep a secret. You know, we have to keep secrets in our households. And the worst she ever did as far as letting a secret out would be she'd phone people at midnight. Now, I don't know what it is with alcoholics, but at midnight, what is this about? We've still got one live one back in Oklahoma. That's his nephew, not mine, who keeps calling us in the middle of the night. They're still doing it out there. And telling us how much they love us and, And she'd get on the phone. Now, this was a long time ago in our little town. The phone was on the wall, and you picked the receiver up, and you put it to your ear, and you told the operator who you wanted to talk to. You said the number, but everybody knew everybody's number. And the operator would say, Pauline, go back to bed. Hazel's asleep. So, we weren't keeping any secrets. And, of course, the operator was our cousin. You can't get away with anything. But we could sort of get away with that little bit of stuff. It wasn't so hard to keep that a secret. And I learned a lot of things, being raised by an alcoholic mom, that I was to use later, even though she was an entirely different personality than the man I married. She was, I learned how to use the morning after guilt. That's a good one. Oh, that's a good one. And I didn't even know I was learning it. I really didn't even know I was learning it. But I knew I could sure get a lot of stuff I wanted by getting her the morning after. I learned to pretend two things, either pretend that it was no big deal. She wasn't with her as far as talking about it. That's nothing, in other words, make it nothing, we don't want to talk about that. Or I would scold her. So I had those two ways of dealing with her drinking. And I carried that over nicely into my family later. So when I met this crazy guy breaking glasses, but there was something about him that attracted me. And that wasn't the time I decided to marry him, by the way. It's true, I did, but not that night. A few weeks later, we were walking across campus, and we were just walking together, and he was saying, I don't know if he remembered me, but we were chatting, and he began having a fist fight with a bee. Now, if you know Cliff, and many of you do, you know how a bee will get in your face and it won't go away? Well, he dropped his books and he began boxing with the bee. He was a drama major, anyway, and which was fun, too. And everybody stopped and watched. And, the traffic was stopped on College Street, and everybody was roaring with laughter. And, of course, the more laughter, the more attention he got, the more he danced and boxed. And I got a kick out of that. And I said, this guy's a lot of fun. Now, that still isn't when I decided to keep him. Here's what happened. Well, a bunch of us were in a car going somewhere. We began going out. And I began noticing that when he got drunk, he got angry. Then I began noticing that he got angry sometimes when he wasn't drunk. Now, that confused me, because he always said, I get angry like that when I drink, but otherwise, things don't bother me. Well, I found out that wasn't true. So I was kind of watching this situation. We were all in a car going somewhere, and we were kind of singing. Now, anybody in the room old enough to know this song, it's called the Desert Song. It's old. There's a few gray heads like mine out there nodding. He began singing it like Donald Duck. Now, wouldn't you marry somebody who could sing like Donald Duck? That did it for me. Sometimes I really get to chuckling in this program. We talk about, if it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck. And then, they describe Al-Anons. I've heard us described as ducks on a pond where we're just, to anybody looking at us, we're just gliding along. But underneath our little feet are going like hell. But we don't show you that. And Peggy Martin, you probably all know this. She told me about the Al-Anon guy. Guy came into Al-Anon with his ducks all lined up. And they came into Al-Anon and we told him that those were not his ducks. And I swear to you, that's been my whole Al-Anon life, is figuring out which ducks were mine and which ones are not mine. But we started off and we just had a grand time. And he spent 6 years in the L.A. Hollywood area, which was, 500 miles down the coast, and trying to become an actor. But meanwhile, because I began realizing that we probably weren't going to make it that way, I worked his way through teacher training. This is where you start noticing the martyr. Tune in, because that's it. I worked his way through teacher training so he could have a credential so that we would at least have that happening. And meanwhile, we began having babies. Again, God in his wisdom, I guess knowing I would need a lot of ongoing reasons to keep coming to Al-Anon, because they began arriving, and before I knew it, I looked around and we had 5 of them. And he likes to say he didn't know where, he'd look around and he'd say, there's another one crying, where'd that one come from, but he exaggerates a little. And finally he went into teaching. And he began teaching at a high school in Oceanside, California. Although we spent 3 years up in the Central Valley in California. Some of you know where that is, I'm sure. And, seeing all that beautiful foliage today, I go back to that time in my life when I was trying to keep this teacher and his drinking a secret from a whole town. The town was called Manteca, which means lard in Spanish. And it was like that to me. It was like a lard town. It was awful. And I had to keep him a secret for the first time in my life because in Hollywood nobody cared what he did. And he was the teacher, and there weren't that many new teachers, so everybody looked at him. And I was trying to keep our dignity intact, which with a guy like Cliff is just a hopeless case. But that's what, we must look respectful no matter what. And that town, I went back to it some years later with my daughter, who had been 7 at the time we lived there. And we were going through there for some reason. And it was this time of the year, and there was beautiful foliage. I went, my God, Kitty, where'd all the color come from? She said, well, Mom, there was always color here. I couldn't see colors when I lived in Manteca. And that was that family disease taking over, wasn't it? I couldn't see colors. I was too busy keeping this a secret and managing this bunch that was keep arriving and trying to prevent and keep his job for him, because he would get on the phone with these speech teams and things and make plans for them all to go on buses, and the next morning he'd forget. So I developed that Al-Anon long ear, where you listen. We only had one phone, and I had to listen in and write down everything, so the next morning he would do what he said he was going to do the night before, because he'd be in a blackout. And I got real busy. And then these kids. And we moved to Oceanside, which is a much really nicer place than Manteca. And he began teaching at the local high school. And I continued my path to make it all look okay on the outside. And boy, I'll tell you, my mom came to live with us after my father died. Cliff invited her, of course. They got along very well. We'd send them shopping for groceries because they were the two that could do it right then. And they'd come home with the damnedest stuff. Pickled pig's feet. No food for dinner, just pickled pig's feet, and vodka, and some odd liqueur nobody had ever heard of, with ice cream to pour it over. That's what we'd have for dinner. But so she came to live with us, and she had fallen and broken her hip. She didn't remember how that happened. She thought it was odd, it had never hurt. And so she was on a little walker, and I was hauling her back and forth to the physical therapist, of course. And just now today, I just chuckle because she was so typical. The physical therapist would say, okay, here's the exercise you're going to do, and you do 5 this week, and you do 10 the next week, But she was alcoholic, so she came home and she did 50. So you know what I mean? And then, of course, she couldn't do anything for 2 weeks because she, and I'd haul her back. Talk about doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. Back to the physical therapist we go. Meanwhile, these kids were growing, and we were running out of money all the time. I don't know if any of you had that experience. And so I thought, well, I was always trying to make money little places here and there. So I began giving piano lessons because I could stay home and watch him. I had to do that. And I had all these kids. Now, I didn't know how to give piano lessons. I just learned how to play piano when I was a kid and thought, well, maybe I can fake it. We Al-Anons can fake a lot of things. A lot of things. And whatever gets you through, huh? And well, I don't know if I was a good piano teacher or they just didn't have enough piano teachers in Oceanside, California, because I was giving 37 piano lessons a week when I came into Al-Anon in 1970. And the reason I remember exactly how many I was giving is because every morning when he got up, I'd say, I'm giving 37 piano lessons a week. And, he never thanked me for that. He kind of remembers me saying that, too. And so neither one of us is ever going to forget that magic number, 30. That's a lot of piano lessons, folks. Hear me talk? And then I began doing everything I could to control the drinking and the anger. The anger was a big piece of it, of controlling him and making sure he didn't lose his job and all the things many of us do. And I've got these kids, and they're growing up in Southern California, which at that time, in the 60s now, there was some good stuff out on the street that helped them feel better about the world. And our house was a happy house, quote, in that we had parties going on all the time. Really did. It was loads of fun. So I'd be in my living room teaching piano lessons, trying to keep a dignified piano studio. Well, in the middle of our house, which was a dining room and a kitchen and some other kind of things, would be all these teachers that would come home after school with him making margaritas. And they had 3 blenders. And have you ever heard people put a blender on crooked, and the sound it makes? And of course, my little students would say, "What was that?" And I say, "Oh, it's just, it happens. It happens in our house." Earlier, we were talking, some of us Al-Anons, about the amazing skills we develop on our way to Al-Anon. Survival skills. And I'm kind of proud of some of them, actually. I mean, I look back, I remember the time he hadn't come home, and it was 5 a.m, and I was standing in the window looking out. Now, we lived in a corner with a lawn, and a corner where everybody drove by one way or another. There he was, spread-eagled, stark naked. It was summertime, and it was about 5 a.m. It was just getting light, and he was surrounded by a little group of paper boys. And I'm trying to be dignified, so I think fast, and I'm kind of proud of this today. I go out there and I say to these paper boys, "Mr. Roach is practicing a new form of meditation." And of course, he didn't remember that whole situation. He'd passed out on the lawn, probably blacked out. When I told him about it, I remember him, and I didn't even remember that until I'd been in Al-Anon a while. More will be revealed. I remembered, oh my God, I remember that. And he said, "My God, which end was up?" And I didn't remember, and that really hurt his feelings. That wasn't what was on my mind. And so I had this household of people not minding me. The kitchen was always full of teachers after school, and my mother on her little walker. Now, you got a picture, 4'10" with a broken hip, so she's probably shorter than that. Always smiling, still periodic, but always smiling. And she'd get out to take her little walk around the block, and she'd bring home little old men. Because they loved her. Everybody loved her. Everybody loved Pauline. She was everybody's grandma, or Pauline. Everybody loved her. We raised the kids in a cul-de-sac where all the families knew each other. And she'd have little old men. And I didn't mind that so much, except for old Mr. Mills, who always dressed in a 3-piece suit no matter what time of day it was, and he always had a little wet spot in the front of his pants. It's hard to stay dignified. So I had to keep them all out of my living room because the parents would be coming and going. And then I had this man who liked to surf. He liked to go down to we're close to Mexico. He'd go down to Baja and surf. And one time he brought back a Mexican art object, which was about a 18-inch high wooden carving of a man's hand with a particular finger extended. And he plopped that on my piano, and he said, "This is my statement to the world, and it belongs in my living room." Just to let you know, that, especially you Al-Anons, you'll know how I had lost track of my choices. I honestly didn't think I should take that off there because he'd made that big statement. But yet I had this dilemma of all these little children coming and taking piano lessons. So what I'd do is just before they'd be due, I'd sneak it off and hide it, and then I'd sneak it back on before he knew. Well, you can't be perfect. And sure enough, one of the parents said, "Can I come and watch the student?" And I said, "Sure." And I realized she's sitting there and she's not watching her child. She's looking. I thought I'd forgotten the damn finger, And I never saw her again. She was the wife of the Baptist minister, which explains. The back of the house was a big family room, and there were 4 bedrooms along one wall. And we had these 5 kids. And there were always other kids living with us. I mean, living with us, not spending the night, living with us. Things would happen in their families that seemed to be worse than ours, I guess. I don't know. They really lived with us for a year or two. And they were welcome. Hell, everybody lived with us. Why not? And then there would be these drunks that would be over drinking all afternoon and wouldn't make it home. And they'd be there for breakfast. And I got real good at cooking fast breakfast in the morning for maybe 15 people. And I really got good. I think I could have run a restaurant or something. And that was another little skill I developed, just because there they were. I had to feed them. And meanwhile, the children were they weren't minding either. Yeah. Our oldest son, and if you've heard my husband talk, you know how he talks about it. He talks about him. So he was a hashish salesman, by the way. The leading one in Oceanside High, I'll tell you. And only the finest kind of hashish. And the thing that's funny about that is that I knew this was happening with the kids, but I was not about to tell him, because then I'd have to deal with him. So today when he talks about it, of course he knows about it today, but he used to just think they were crazy, because he didn't know they were loaded on something all the time. David was selling hashish out his back door. Every half hour somebody'd come. And then, of course, my students were coming in every half hour. And in the middle of the house, the teachers are kind of stumbling in and out, and the little old man and my mother in her walker. And I'm trying to have a dignified household. But I learned how to sit at that piano, and I could tell you when a kid made a mistake. I could tell you which batch of margaritas they were on. I could tell you when somebody just left to go get some more tequila. You know those things. I could tell you which sale David had just made out the back door. And I could also tell you two of my daughters' boyfriends had gotten in the habit of coming in their bedroom windows on the side of the house. Broad daylight, I don't know why they did that. They were welcome to come in. They were used to that. And I could hear those windows go up and down, and I could tell David just made another sale, and I'd hear all this stuff going on in the living room, and I would just feel so honorable and precious, and my God, what would he do without me? But living with an alcoholic, it's real easy to look good. You don't have to do anything. You stand still long enough, and they'll do something bad enough that you're going to look better than that. And there'd be these moments, more than moments, often, where I just remember why I married that guy and why I wanted to keep him. And it would be something like, I remember one time I'm in the living room giving piano lessons, and I'm teaching this little kid to play a number called Humoresque. If any of you know anything about music at all, it's a dancey it's got a lot of rhythm to it. Out of one doorway, because you could do that, you could go through the living room and out another doorway. With the student's back is to the room, I'm facing the rest of the room, comes my husband, dancing with a pair of little white shorts with red devils on them, which I had given him, of course, and a red rose in his mouth, and he's leaping across the room to the time to Humoresque. Now, how can you stay mad at anybody? Time and again. Or he'd say something in Donald Duck talk, and I'd be finished, Forget what I was mad about, Sometimes I think, living with alcoholism, especially one like mine, is like playing the slot machines. They pay off just often enough to keep you. I love the slots. I keep putting quarters in. I remember I thought of this concept. I was at Reno, and I'm sitting there putting my little quarters in the slot machine. I'm kind of a cheapskate, and this guy next to me is winning some money, and I'm still putting my quarters in, and I'm not getting anything. And then he gets up and leaves. And I look over, I think, I wonder if I ought to change slot machines. That one might be paying off. And then I'm thinking, talk about a pre-ALANON thought. No, I got too much invested in this one. Just watch somebody else will come along and get the jackpot. Surprisingly, I got the jackpot, not the one I thought. My jackpot is ALANON. I also got him to go to a psychiatrist one time. He agreed to do that. It was probably a morning after promise. The psychiatrist prescribed antabuse. I'd never heard of that before, but I like the sound of it. And I minored in chemistry and stuff, so I went down to the medical library in the big university nearby us, looked up the formula for antabuse. Folks, I have no idea what I was doing, but I thought I knew. And because we both knew he could not go a week without drinking at this point. And he had to get up and get to school, and he had this big speech team that was always winning things, and I got to take it off with him on those things so I could, because he drank on those weekends with all those high school kids, and I had to be sure that I kept him in a corner while I did all that. See what I mean by how did he manage without me? He couldn't have. And he never thanked me for that either, now that I think about it. And the thing is that we both knew by then that he couldn't go a week without drinking. And so the idea was to get him through the week and so he could drink on weekends. So that's why I went down and looked up the formula for antabuse. Now, I didn't know what I was doing, but by this time, I was so into whatever I thought would work. So I devised this little formula of my own out of that and figured if we give him if he takes one on Monday, one on Tuesday, and a half of one on Wednesday, he can safely drink on Friday night. Well, that would have worked, except he always drank on Thursday night. And have you ever seen anybody drink on antabuse? Ooh. Well, it's kind of, when you're already pissed off, excuse me, do you say that here in South Dakota? It's kind of fun to watch the reaction because they get real anxious, and that's kind of fun. And but these big red blotches would come out all over him, and in fact, Thursday nights in our little Brook Street home, the little cul-de-sac where everybody came, the kids would come over on Thursdays to watch Mr. Roach glow. That's what they used to say. He'd just wah, wah. And then I began realizing that sometimes he wasn't taking that antabuse. So I began, of course, making sure he took it. And then I'd make sure he took it and he'd still drink. And I thought, what's going on? I realized he's not swallowing. Now, have you ever given a dog a pill? You stroke their throat. And if his Adam's apple went up and down, I knew I was going to have a good day. And my kids to this day say, Mom, we thought that was such a cute little affectionate gesture, the way you sent Dad off to school, stroking his throat. And by this time he knew he was in trouble, but of course he couldn't. And he'd gone into AA and out of AA, and well, the doctor died, and so we didn't have a prescription anymore. But we only lived 40 miles from Tijuana, Mexico. So I would take our little station wagon, which my father had given us, and it had become a surfing wagon. And I'd take my small child, I always had a small child in a car seat, and I would wear my two-piece polyester pantsuit. Remember the days, the 60s? With my bubble hairdo. And I would go down to Tijuana, and I'd put her in a stroller, and I'd go from pharmacy to pharmacy, buying a few packages of antabuse at each one. I didn't want any one of those Mexican pharmacists to realize how much I needed. I wasn't sick. They'll love to sell you their whole stock if you'll pay for it. They don't care. And then I'd be sitting in my car coming back, and I think, this is smuggling. God, that's against the law. So I would get a piñata. And wasn't that clever? And of course, stuff it with antabuse and put it in the back seat. Now who's gonna stop a lady in a two-piece polyester pantsuit with a 2-year-old in the front seat and a piñata in the back seat? But I start getting scared because there's always a long wait at those borders. I think, boy, this is a federal offense. If they catch me, they'll put me in a federal prison, and they'll take my small child, and they'll put her in a shelter. And I think, but then he'll know the sacrifices I've made for him. And I was wearing out. You may guess that. I always had a lot of energy, and I could always keep going. But, boy, I was going in a real sick, busy way, trying to manage this whole crowd that were acting not the way they should. And I remember a particular night standing in my living room looking at that bunch of people. And I remember a few nights before, I had had some sort of a different feeling come over me because I was feeling so helpless. And I'm sure I cried out to the God of my understanding then in some way. And I had some sort of a sense of, I won't call it peace, it was far from that, but it was a sense that I would know. I think. It's the only way I know how to describe it. But I know something shifted in me a little bit. And a few nights later, I'm standing in my living room, and I'm looking at this family and a few other people that there always were there. And here's my husband in his chair talking to the TV, which wasn't turned on. He was always doing that. He still does that, by the way. If you know him, you can tell him that. And I'm answering him because he was really talking to last night's 11 o'clock news. I figured he had about a 10-hour lag time or something like that. And it's the only way I could communicate with him. And so he's talking to nothing, and I'm answering him. And there's David. Now, David, meanwhile, he developed a little interest in LSD and some other hallucinogenics. And he would see, have you ever been around? Well, you've already did it yourself, some of you. I mean, it's nuts to watch. It's really nuts. People, he'd see things, and he was weird, is what he was. And I knew what he was doing. Now, Cliff didn't know what he was doing. He just thought he was weird. But I knew what was happening with David, because that was the other thing. I'd find all these things around the house, these little pills or little stuff, and I'd run down to my friend the cop, the detective. Get this. I was very busy in the community, too. I didn't tell you about that, because I always did that kind of stuff. And Ron would say, well, this is such and such, and the antidote for it, if you need it. I mean, I was narking on my own kids. Never gave a second thought. All I wanted was, what do I do if they're taking this and something goes bad? And he'd help me out, this detective friend, which is kind of humorous looking back on it, I just think back, my God, what was I doing? Well, David was acting that way. The oldest daughter, Kitty is her name, and she's in Al-Anon for many, many years now, and she really gives a good talk. She's been going places with Cliff now and talking when I don't want to go or can't. And it's amazing because we have 3 entirely different stories, She was the oldest, and there's 5. And in that living room, she's trying to make us happy. And she's trying to make us happy by feeding us. That's still what she does. Try to make us happy by feeding us. And she's, in this particular evening, there's David doing this stuff, and there's Kitty passing out things to eat. Now, I think the night she passed out the brownies, we probably did feel better. We just didn't know why, Everybody got kind of mellow. And then our middle kid is named Jan, and Jan was an angry child. She was angry, I swear, from the time she was old enough to show anger. And guess what? She's an alcoholic. Surprise, surprise, that was coming. And she was 14, and she was really angry, and she would sit in her chair and hate to be there, and anger would emanate from her and out of every pore. And I couldn't seem to ever know what I could do about that anger. And it was an awful feeling. I felt terrible for her to be that angry. I hadn't had to grow up in anger, and she did. And our next kid down the line is named Chris, and he was 10. Now, Chris was talented. He is very talented. He's got all his dad's talent, and he's got musical talent. He's got anything you could ask for. And he could make his dad smile, which he took on as his job. Little tow-headed kid, stand on a chair singing with an Irish accent, of course, to please Daddy. Edelweiss, because Cliff had been producing The Sound of Music, and Chris would go up there, which sounds kind of weird with an Irish accent, by the way, but he'd stand there and just sing Edelweiss, because that was what was going on in the family, over and over. And people would come in, they said, there's a little tow-headed blonde kid, he just keeps singing on that chair. And we said, that's what Chris does, because his daddy would smile every once in a while. And what are we looking at? We're really looking at an alcoholic family. Everybody doing what they needed to do to survive. And then there was Mary. And Mary was 7, and Mary had learned how to get through those times because we had our living room arranged always had a couple of couches for all those people on a diagonal, and she would put her stuff behind one of the couches, and we all called it Mary's Corner. And Mary would have her stuff in the corner, and she would stay there all evening, and sometimes Mary would sleep there all night, and I wouldn't have even known it till I got up the next day. And I didn't know it because she didn't require my attention. I'm not proud of any of that, but that's the way I was handling things. I was mainly trying to keep peace at any price. And of course, my little mother on her walker. And I remember that night just thinking, what am I doing wrong? I am completely inadequate here. Absolutely took on the whole responsibility as mine, that I wasn't somehow fixing this family. Now, a few days later, my husband and I had another little skirmish. It was all over a 10-year-old kid, and something was going on, and he said what he said when I gave him a dirty look or told him to stop something, which was, I might as well move out. Any of you heard that one? And my answer was, that is not how you solve problems. You solve them by talking about them. You see, I was a psychology major. I hate to admit that, but that's what I was. And, of course, I'd taken on the whole drama department to analyze. They loved it. And my lines were to talk about. Well, for 20 years, those have been our lines. And why that night, when he said, I might as well move out, I said, good idea. Isn't that interesting? One more time. God was doing for me what I could not do for myself. I had no idea I was going to say those words. I had no idea how I was going to manage that family. I had no reason to think he was going to be helpful financially. At that point, my mother, I had to figure out I never even thought of that stuff. I just said goodbye. Well, he left. And he went back to AA one more time. I wasn't all that impressed. He'd been in and out of AA for 5 years on and off. Frankly, he was worse when he was going to AA than when he was drinking. Kids used to say, God, give him a drink, And he was dreadful. And I know, now that I've gotten to know lots of AA people, I understand that better. But he was miserable, and then he'd drink again. And we'd get our hopes up, and he'd drink again. And he was awful. He was worse ever than he had been drinking. And he moved out. And it was then I began, just a little bit, beginning to recognize what I was doing in myself, how I was chipping away all the time at my self-esteem, and all the ways I had compromised my values, little by little by little. Each little compromise was just to keep peace at any price. A little something here, a little something there, a little something here. And after 20 years, I had jumped all the way out to here, and I would not have jumped from here to here. But I didn't see it that way, you see. It was little by little by little. One of our good friends in the program named Clint Hodges, Frank knows him, talks about nickel and diming himself to death with alcohol, and I always relate to that because I nickel and dimed my whole self-esteem and everything I believed in over 20 years. So then I began getting a little hint of that after he moved out. When I told my mother, of course, she said, oh, poor Cliff. Well, he went back to AA this time, and he did it differently. He went around the corner to this little jerk of a man and from Oceanside Electric Company, and it was Bill Blake. Did you know Bill, Frank? Yeah. And Bill's been dead about 15 years now. And excuse me, I shouldn't address Frank sitting here, but he's one of the bunch that I know. So, and he was a rude little guy, and he'd been kind of following Cliff around all this time, and he'd been in AA about 8 years then. And he drove this little Oceanside electric truck, and he always parked it wherever he wanted to, in the middle of the street. Nobody ever gave him a ticket, and it made me mad, He got away with murder. And he'd come bursting in my door, and he'd say, you need to go to Al-Anon, and he'd give me some pamphlets. And I'd say, well, I don't need to go to Al-Anon. I was a psychology major. And he did that for about a month or two. And then he figured me out, that wily little guy. I didn't like him, by the way. He was rude. He walked right in my house. He never even rang the door. Well, we couldn't ring the doorbell. There's a little alcoholic story around that. But he didn't even knock. He'd just be standing next to me at the kitchen sink. And it scared the out of me. So he said, but after a couple of times of this, he came in quietly, even knocked on the door, sat down quietly, which wasn't his style to be quiet. He was a busy, active little guy. He says, Pat, I've been checking out the Al-Anon in Oceanside, and I think they could use your help. Thank God for that nasty little electrician. He had figured me out. And he also was wise enough to do it on a day that he knew there was a meeting. Because I said, oh, really? He said, I think they could use your help. That was St. Patrick's Day of 1970. And I went to a meeting that night. And I've been helping you ever since. And the beauty of that is that when I got here, you told me you needed me. Don't you? I love that. You said, we're so glad you're here. We really need you. I didn't understand the full meaning of what you meant at that time. And right away I was swept into service. And here's how the first thing happened. There was a lady in our meeting, and we had a meeting and a half in Oceanside back then, which means that you never knew if the other one anybody's going to come to it. There was an old lady named Millie. She probably is younger than I am now, but she looked like an old lady to me back then. And I don't know if she ever really sponsored any person, but she sponsored everybody who got near her. She just directed traffic. She was a real advocate of the traditions and being of service. So she said, you look to me like somebody who could really be a good one to greet newcomers at the door. Would you stand there and do that next week? Well, I'd been in a sorority, and I knew about receiving lines. And I know. So I said, of course. Now, we had about 8 or 10 people in that meeting. We got a newcomer maybe once a month, But isn't that interesting, God's timing? Because that's where I was at my post the next week, of course, to show these people how to do this right. And so a newcomer came to the door. And I said my name, because I know how to do that. And she said her name, and she said, "I'm scared." And I said, "So am I." And that is the first time I know of that I actually realized that I would admit that I was scared. Out of a newcomer's mouth. 1 week I was coming to a meeting, and already I was hearing somebody share what I felt. Because I had gotten far, far away from ever letting you know anything was going on inside of me that wasn't okay. It scared me, to tell you the truth. That newcomer didn't come back, didn't matter though, did it? She was there. I don't know where she went. It doesn't matter. She was there when I needed her. Something shifted in me a little. Didn't know how to explain it then. It surprised me. I said that. And of course, Millie had a lot more little jobs for me to do. And I'd meanwhile been chasing Cliff around, going up to Clancy's group, which is where Frank's from, and examining those people in the backyard. Back in 1970, there weren't thousands of them. There were just hundreds. And they were all, jockeying to get to be the one to clean up the dog poop. That was their big goal. I mean, this are the kind of people he'd gotten us involved in now. And I wasn't all that thrilled with his outfit except I did like Charlotte, but as Clancy's wife. But I mean, wow, they were weird in some. But I did. After a while, there was a woman up there that I thought, I want what she has. And people in Oceanside nobody was talking about sponsoring. They were going to meetings and they kind of talked about the steps, and and the slogans were really what everybody talked about. And they certainly saw that newcomers got tended to, but it just wasn't structured much yet. Yeah. So there I am up there where there's lots of structure. And this was Sally C. And Sally had what I wanted. She's tall, she sings like a bird, and she's got big boobs. I didn't get any taller, nothing happened to the boobs, and I still can't sing very well. But she was a wonderful sponsor for me because she was very clear on the small things to do. And I began little by little learning how to change my lines. And that's really what it was, how to change my lines. I mean, we'd have these arguments. Or I'd be so angry at something I thought I had to do. I always felt so imposed upon. And she'd say, "Well, you have a choice here." And she gave me one-liners. Now, this is like being in kindergarten, but, which I guess I was. And she'd say, "Well, when somebody's demanding," and she's really talking about Cliff here, because I had set him up to expect me to always leap in and solve any problem, big or small, that happened. The keys, couldn't find the car keys, right? There I am. Couldn't find somebody's phone number. There I am. Everything, I would just leap right in. And she said, "You need to learn how to say, 'I don't know.'" Well, that's not a concept, believe me, I thought I could do. I mean, I got all my strokes out of knowing everything, whether I knew it or not, of course, but, I'd answer something. So she said, "You have to try to do that." So I did. And sometime I don't remember what it was about, but I remember one of those times when I normally would have just leaped in there and fixed it, and I said, I don't know. I had to kind of shout it because I didn't know. And it kind of startled everybody, including the kids. They all kind of looked around for, trouble. And then I said to her, "It sounds so rude." She says, "Well, here's what you do. You say, 'Gosh, I don't know.'" Now, wouldn't you think a person with a degree in psychology could figure out that? When you hear somebody say, "Gosh," you just can't get mad at them, can you? "Gosh, I don't know." Well, this was fun. I'll tell you, it got to be fun. And then I made good friends with some people up in Laguna Beach because Bill's wife, Margie, was a sober alcoholic woman who was wonderful to me. And I used to run over to her house because she was right around the corner, all distressed and carrying on. And she'd yell at me. She said, Pat, you have to trust. And I'd scream, I can't trust him. And she'd say, "I don't mean Cliff, I can't trust him either. I'm talking about God." And she was wonderful. And that wonderful alcoholic woman took me to Laguna Beach, where there was a meeting that had been in existence for about 20 years. It started by a lady named Elsa Chamberlain. And she knew there was more solid ALANON. It's not that I wasn't continuing to attend in Oceanside, but she got me there, and I don't know if she had other things to do that Monday noon meeting, but she took me there enough times so that I began feeling like going myself. And I had that solid, wonderful ALANON traditions. Elsa in that group, and Teresa, she was in some of our books. Anyway, what a blessing for me. And it was Elsa that used to say every once in a while, not just at Al-Anon meetings. She said it openly, so I can quote her. She'd say, sometimes sober is worse than drunk. We all go, oh my God, because she was married to this God person, which I didn't really see him that way, but I thought he had this stupid little hee laugh. Did you ever hear? But that was my attitude back then. So I had the best of all worlds, and I'm so grateful for Margie for taking the time to haul me up there full of all my I was just so arrogant and so intent on not having anything look wrong and so snobbish and all those things, and to take the trouble to take me up there so that I had that. And what I could do then is bring back those things I learned to help learn what we needed to in Oceanside. Millie, meanwhile, was always asking me to drive her places. She said she didn't have her driver's license. I don't know about that. And I drove her to San Diego one time because she was putting together in the early 1970 the bylaws for the San Diego intergroup. We don't call them information services there. We call them intergroups. And I didn't have a role to play except that I drove her. So I'm sitting there listening, and this bunch of people began arguing with each other. A lot of you in this room are in service. Do you notice how we get in service, how we get a cause, and how we change personalities? And we can be so loving and sweet in an Al-Anon meeting, but when we got a service cause, at least I change personalities. I get, my gosh, I'm right about something. Well, they were doing that, and I got a little scared. I'd never seen that in Al-Anon. Then I saw them stop, and one of the women said, listen to us. We're not putting principles above personalities. Let's hold hands and say the serenity prayer and begin again. Now, I've been here in that tradition. Of course, I'd read it for quite a while by then. But I watched them practice the principle of principles above personalities. And I'm telling you, I had a spiritual shift in me that was it felt like you could see it. I knew something changed in me. And again, God in his wisdom, when I went home that day, that 14-year-old wanted to do some things with a 21-year-old, which is what she wanted, and I'm saying no. And she screamed, I hate you, at me. I've never heard a kid say that. I hate you. And out of my mouth came these words. I said, Jan, it's more important for me to like myself than it is for you to like me. And I'm going to be the best mom I know how to be, and you can't go. That was principles above personalities, and I learned right away I could start doing these right now. And so my life has gone on. Life has been in session in our family. A few months after we'd been here, my mother wanted to drink again. She was periodic. She could wait a while. And when she approached me this time to drink, there was no booze in our house. I was taught to support sobriety, and Cliff didn't want booze on. It was fine. There might have been some booze in the back bedroom with the kids. I don't really know, but there wasn't any. And so in order for her to bring it up and still look like she didn't need it, she needed to make it sound like it was something. So she said, why don't we get a bottle of wine and relax, to me. And I answered her differently than I ever had because of you people. And I said, Mom, the last time you went on a binge, you nearly died. You'd had a stroke. And the doctor said if you do it again, you may not live. And I cannot participate. I love you. You're welcome to come to AA with us. Or you're welcome to drink if you'd like. She could get her own booze. She didn't need me to do it. My mom didn't drink. And she didn't go to AA. 2 days later, my mom committed suicide. Because of the wonderful people already in AA and Al-Anon, especially the AA women, I never once felt responsible for that. I felt so sad that she couldn't have she would have been a wonderful AA. But our home was filled with people. We hadn't even been coming here but a few months, helping me understand that she couldn't abide not drinking. To drink in that house would have been a statement of her problem bigger than she was willing to make, and she wasn't willing to go to AA. She chose the way out that she needed to choose. We've had our daughter gave birth to a child because she couldn't keep her body clean and sober. Little Sarah was born. I was delegate at the time and was heading for New York. And they said she was going to have to operate on this little 3-pound baby. I had a commitment. And she's got a lot of brothers and sisters. And my sponsor said, go where you're supposed to go. Go be the delegate. That's what you're supposed to do. That baby didn't live. And I knew my daughter knew that she had contributed to that little girl dying, being born early. The next one she had lived, Nick's 22 now, 23. And again, she would sit in a hospital with that little guy 4 or 5 years old, still struggling with the effects of being born of a mother who couldn't keep her body clean and sober, and I'd watch my daughter have to leave that hospital bed and go out to relieve herself with something, whether it was a joint or whether it was a drink. And I knew, because of you people, I knew to let her do what she had to do, that I couldn't help her. That daughter got sober, and she was sober 10 years, and she began taking Vicodin because she had a bad back. And she went out again and drank. So it's only a day at a time here, folks. There's no guarantees. Jan is back in AA now for 5 years, and she's a different person than she was that first 10 or 11 years. Scared to death of pills now, which is very healthy. The things, life goes on. Life is hard sometimes, but not with the program, because there's so much support. My son, Chris, who had a hip disorder, he was in pain from the time he was 7 years old until about 2 years ago when he was 40-something. He got surgery for that finally. They developed something. And he was out of pain for the first time. And 2 weeks ago, something went wrong with his back as a result of the hip problem for all those years, and he's back in pain again. And, I'm mad because he went through his life in pain. He doesn't need any more. But, I got to believe that that's God's will, and something's going to be okay there. David is sober 4 years. He's not growing hashish anymore or selling it. Got a few little incidents around that. When he was in the Peace Corps, between his bachelor's and master's, he was in Colombia, which is is that God's sense of humor? It's real easy to release somebody, by the way, when they're 8,000 miles away. And he had been in and out of AA, a bad drinker, but money, property, and prestige. So how could he be alcoholic? And 4.5 years ago, I stood in an emergency room when the doctor told me he's not going to live. His blood level was 0.40. And he said, I don't think he's going to live. And I stood there and said goodbye to my son and told him how sorry I was that he had to do this. But I loved him. And obviously he lived, not because of anything I did. And he emailed me when he was able to get himself back home. He doesn't live in town. And he said, I hope I never see that expression on your face again. So I emailed back and I said, I hope you don't either, But I don't know. I knew what I was supposed to do. I was supposed to go be by his side if he was dying. And so I did what Al-Anon's taught me to do. Our youngest daughter, Mary, spent a long time picking out the right guy. And she did. She was married a few years ago, and they haven't been able to get pregnant. And they did some in vitro, and she finally got pregnant with twins. We're very happy, and last weekend they lost those twins. Just about 2 weeks too early, 2 little boys. And Mary never went to any of the program, but she grew up from the time she was 7 with the teachings of this program. And within a day, she's saying, I can go back and do this again. And I don't know what God's plan is, but whatever it is, it'll be okay. And of course, we're all heartbroken to lose those babies because she waited a long time to do this, and it was a hard thing to go through. And it wasn't too hard for me to come away this weekend because they're still grieving. I was awful close, And because you see our whole family's there to support her. Well, not Cliff. He's up doing serenity retreats. But brothers and sisters and nephews and nieces, people that love her are all there. And I know she's okay. And all I do is phone her. She wants me to call her every once in a while. She's got a wonderful husband. Life's in session. But with this program, we just do what we're supposed to do. Any decision I make, and it's always a matter of figuring out which ducks are mine, any decision I make is based on what's right for me in my heart, not what's necessarily going to make you do a certain thing. And I'm very comfortable with that today. With sponsor guidance, my sponsor today is in Laguna Beach. Her name's Karen Ackerlund. She's Swedish. You should hear her talk. She's got a great talk. So I'm connected with her every week. And I'm very, very fortunate. We're fortunate in our lives. We've had the kind of things people go through, but we've had more support than most people ever get, ever get. I made amends to my sister, who is still mad at me and has scared the hell out of her when I made amends to her. And so I left her alone, but I'm not going to do that to her. But I can tell you this. I couldn't see the colors when I was in Manteca. I could see them here. And when I was teaching piano, I used to tell the kids, and they say, Mrs. Roach, what's that tiny little note? And you don't have to know much about music to know what a grace note is. What's that tiny little note? I say, oh, just ignore it. I didn't even want to hear the grace notes. But I do today, I'll tell you. I don't teach piano anymore, by the way. I went back to graduate school, and I'm doing the work I was supposed to be doing in the first place. But today, I hear the grace notes, and I see the colors. And it's all because of you and you wonderful people. And those of you who didn't go away when I needed you. So I'm not going to go away, because somebody might need me. Thank you.